John, thank you for coming in tonight.
Thank you.
And for the interview. First thing I want to do, as I did with the last candidate, and I'll do it the next, and we just did it informally, but I'd like to formally introduce who we are on the board, and then see if you have any questions regarding process and such. I'm Steve Goldie, I'm the chairman of the board.
Zen Tafoya, vice chair.
James Marzoli, board member.
Oh, sorry, Rick Schubert, retiring secretary.
And John Arena, member of the board.
And thanks. Again, thank you for coming forward, submitting your application. At this point, I'll just ask if you have any process questions that we can answer. If not, then we can just get right into it.
Not at this time, no.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
If you want to just start off, tell us a little bit about yourself. Just, we have your resume, but just a little bit about yourself and some of your experience, and then why you're interested in the Reading position.
Okay. I have spent 31 years in public service. I've never been involved in any other vocation other than public service. I started at the State House in Boston many years ago, back in the early 80s. Worked for the city of Springfield for a number of years, was the municipal grants manager, and was the police commissioner for the city of Springfield. I was one of 5 civilian police commissioners. And from there, in 1994, I left the city of Springfield and worked in Blackstone for about 2.5, close to 3 years. Spent the majority of my tenure in public management in the city, in Mansfield, Massachusetts, and then recently in Abington. I have many characteristics and qualities that I think are important to a town manager in a dynamic, complex organization like Reading. I'm a collaborative type decision maker. I work in teams and groups. I believe that input, whether public or staff input, is extremely important to the decision-making process, and it is important to establish a high level of transparency in government so that the information that you are providing to residents, board members, board and committees is information that people can make informed decisions around. And that's important. I look at the job of a town manager as a steward in many respects, where you are working with the various departments, boards and committees, but more importantly, I think from the standpoint of making decisions, it's important that there is a top-down, bottom-up approach to decision-making. It is not really a top-down approach, and I don't work in that style. I have finance team members that I work with formulating, developing the budget. We had reached a consensus budget with the Finance Committee, and every year that I have been employed, either in Mansfield or in Blackstone, and for that matter, in Abington as well. Because I think it's important for the residents to understand and know that while there may be contentious issues regarding budgets or regarding social or domestic issues or economic development issues, it's very important that the leadership roles start from the top down, and that we reach consensus on a majority of important decisions. Otherwise, what happens in many cases is a town meeting becomes somewhat of a free-for-all, where if there's no direction, there's no ability for us to lead the community in a direction, then they'll lead themselves in a direction that may not necessarily be the most productive, for the town. I understand that leadership is a dynamic process, and I have participated in different areas of government, from state government to local government. I'm a strong advocate for the community in which I serve and represent. I immerse myself in the community in the sense that I become involved in civic organizations, and I get involved in making sure that I understand what the issues are of the community as well as members of the Board of Selectmen. You're going to hear it first. The residents elect you, and they want to make sure that their voices are heard. But it's important from a public policy perspective, especially with the town manager's role, to be involved in the day-to-day community activities, to be involved with the senior citizen groups, to be involved with the stakeholder groups, to be involved with the organizations for Little League, baseball, football, soccer, because I think it's within that dynamic of involvement that you really get to hear what's on people's minds. And that's important because you need to gauge the community sentiment. You need to know where they're coming from so that the decisions that you're making, the budgets that you're fashioning, the ability for you to respond to their needs is first and foremost a process that the town manager must be cognizant of and be aware of. And it's not a process where I know everything. I don't. I'm not the type of individual that would pretend to be the expert in every aspect of government. And I work very closely with department heads. I want to make sure that they have the resources that they need to be successful. If they're not successful, the town as a whole isn't successful. Whether it's the school committee, the DPW department, the DPW division, or any of our important town departments, and they're all important. I would like to say that I believe that in my role as a manager, that it would be very important for me to ensure that the interests of the town as a whole are met first and foremost. That this position is not a position of ownership, it's a position of shared responsibility. That I work as closely as I can with members of the Board of Selectmen, boards and committees, and I do it in a way that allows us to reach a consensus. And I know I've read some articles that have been published recently, and I hope I have the chance to address those, because I think it's important for you to understand who the real John D'Agostino is. And I know that most of you are astute enough to understand that sometimes what's printed in the paper isn't always the truth. And I would like the opportunity at some point in this process to, address those issues. Unfortunately, it casts a negative light, but it's once you understand what went on and my side of the story, I think that you'll walk away with a comfort level, hopefully, that would give you the opportunity to make an informed decision as to who you would like for your next town manager.
Actually, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I interrupted. You go ahead.
I'm glad you brought that up. Doing our due diligence, right? I've come across that, and part of you mentioned collaboration, and it's something that we want to talk a little bit about, and collaboration within the town amongst boards, committees, commissions, so on and so forth. So I think now's the best time to address and bring that up.
Okay. When I was hired in the town of Abington, I was hired as a change agent. The town had been through some very difficult financial times. They overspent their budget by $720,000. They had a negative free cash certification. Never saw it in my life. The right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. And I came in and made a number of changes, both in policy, administrative policy, and with the blessing of the Board of Selectmen, the initial board that was elected. And when you become a change agent in the public arena, many times the decisions that you make generate some people who are not satisfied with those decisions. We felt it was important, the board also agreed, to make sure that elected officials were not representing private interests before boards and committees. That was happening in Abington. And we initially started the process to try to get that changed. And unfortunately, there were some boards and committees who didn't like that change, that they were very comfortable with the environment that they had currently or previously, and that they were not ready for any kind of change. The information that's out there that I don't work well with committees is obviously not true at all. I worked very effectively with all boards and committees. We ended up with 3 consensus budgets, the Finance Committee, one of the most important committees in town government. And you don't do that by not working well with committees. You just cannot do that. The committee that was referenced in the article was the Board of Assessors, which is an elected board. One of its members was brought up on state ethics charges. It was a fine. My issue was that I wanted to make sure that those types of transparencies were public, that people knew what was going on. They didn't have televised board or committee meetings, and I thought it was important from a transparency perspective to make sure that boards and committees were televised, that people knew how they arrived at their decisions. And these committees obviously didn't want to do that. The other committee was obviously the Board of Health. And the Board of Health had a trash program that was inefficient. It was costing the town well over $1 million. And I knew from my experience in Mansfield that we could lower that price. So we did. We actually saved close to $300,000, $340,000 by implementing automated trash collection at curbside service for both trash and recycling. And we are getting paid for recycling tonnage now under this new contract. But to implement that change was a nip and tug fight all the way, with the Board of Selectmen finally having to intervene early on in the process. Well, the board changed. New people were elected, others didn't run, and as a result of that, the type of change and initiative that we had set forth in the first year and a half, the board members were not there to support that continuation. There were a number of individual employment contracts that were multi-year contracts that were not legal, were not proper. We changed that. I was required to look at the organization as a whole when I first started and to make sure that we made those difficult changes. And then when I woke up in my 3rd year of service, I looked around and the majority of board had changed and the direction had changed. And the individuals that were elected to that position were more inclined to maintain the status quo. So when it came time for my contract renewal, based on all of the accomplishments that we had set forth and had achieved over a short period of tenure, my tenure in Abington, they had to find some excuse. And I think that what they basically said was that I couldn't work with 1 or 2 boards, which was the furthest from the truth. I am a collaborative problem solver. That's my nature. That's my life. That's what I do as a public servant. And so for me, it was very hard to sit there at that meeting and listen to them try to grapple with an excuse or a reason why they shouldn't renew my contract. And the story in the newspaper, I had a chance to glance at it, talked about malfeasance. There was no malfeasance. They ended up saying it was nonfeasance. But I achieved all of my goals and objectives. In each of the years that I had goals and objectives, I either met or exceeded all of those goals from every board member. The individual member who made the motion not to renew my contract gave me all 4s and 5s on a scale of 1 to 5. So it was clearly, I had unearthed some issues that I thought needed to be addressed, and I would do it again, because I work for the greater good of the town, not for the special interests of a certain few. And it's important to make sure that the leadership and the people understand that. I believe that if you were to talk to the residents of Abington, that they would tell you that my tenure there was very productive, that they appreciated moving in the right financial direction. We have not had an operational override that passed in the town, so it was very clear that they wanted prudent fiscal management. That's my strong suit, and that's what I do the best. I look at organizations, I understand processes, and I implement efficiencies in those processes, and sometimes change is difficult in the public sector. And as a result of that, that's one of the reasons why my contract was not renewed. If I was working in the private sector, I would probably have not only a renewed contract, but a significant increase and bonus. But that's not the reality. The reality is it's a political environment, and I work in that political environment, but I am not going to sacrifice the moral characteristic of the decisions that I make because of a political decision. I think it's important that residents understand that politics does not drive decisions. The well-being of the community drives those decisions.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. John, you had a question?
Yeah, just maybe to turn our head a little bit to more the positive side of collaboration. One of Reading's enviable reputations is its education and school system. I moved here 30 years ago, and even then it was, among real estate agents, it was, well, if you move to Reading, you're going there for the schools.
Exactly.
It was and it's a reputation that extends to today. As you think about your past working with school committees, the educational side of the town, can you describe the collaboration you've had with that side in your past workings?
Absolutely. I think that when I first came to Abington, I met with I would meet with all of the department heads. I would meet with all the stakeholders. I would find out their frame of reference, where they were coming from, what they needed, what was important. My first meeting was with the assistant town manager. My second meeting was with the superintendent of schools. As a town manager, newly hired, and I sat with Peter Schaefer for close to an hour and a half, and we talked about what he needed to be successful. The school committee, high school was on accreditation warning. They were one step away from losing their accreditation, and I wanted to make sure that I could work effectively with Peter, and I wanted him to know that as town manager, it wasn't an us versus them environment. It was we. Because as I had indicated to you earlier, if the school department fails, the town fails. If the DPW department fails, the town fails. And we weren't going to allow that to happen. We were at the cusp of closing one school, the middle school. And I would not allow that to happen. We found the money within the operating budget of the town to keep that school open. We weren't going to go through additional layoffs. We were devastated by a number of layoffs. We were $720,000 negative free cash certification when I came to the town. We saved the Frollo School from closing. We increased their budget approximately $400,000 over 2 years. We became more efficient in how we operate and organize the town as a whole. But when we finally got to the point of working with the schools, it was a breath of fresh air for both Peter and I, because we were able to accomplish things that we could not accomplish unless we were working together. And it was important to make sure that that collaboration was there. And we meet on a weekly basis. The superintendent for business, the assistant superintendent for business, Peter Schaefer, myself, the finance team, every Thursday at 10 o'clock, it's a standing meeting. And he's there. And, he tells me, this is what I need to be successful. This is what I need. This is my bottom line. And I know that Peter and our relationship is so strong that I believe him. I know it's true. And by bringing the other essential elements of the town function to the table, the finance team, they understand that as well. So it's not a point of sitting down and convincing me what his bottom line is. I know what it is, because we work very closely together to make sure that that happens. And it's very important. People move in and out of communities because of the school system. Crime is also an important factor as well. The fact that this community is putting money in an area which I think is very important, which is drug prevention. I think that's very important for us to do that. I have lived through the short 3 years that I have been in Abington. I have lived through a number of teenagers, high school students, who have committed suicide. And most of that is as a result of drugs and use of drugs. It is a scourge on our society. It's a scourge on our kids. And we have to create the environment to make those kids successful. And that's very important.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John, I had a few questions relating to the profile, but I'll get to those later. I guess if you could go back to, you explained some of the scenario in Abington. Could you talk a little bit about Mansfield, which I guess was at 3 years? Could you maybe explain?
Absolutely, absolutely. The Mansfield scenario, although it sounds very complicated and complex, it's very simple. When we had an employee...
You had been at Mansfield for what?
12 years.
12 years?
Yeah. And what I think is important to understand, that decision that came down in the court system came down in 1997. I left Mansfield on June 30th, 2009. So my departure was a change in philosophy, a change in the board, a change in direction. It had nothing to do with the lawsuit at all. As a matter of fact, to explain it to you very simply, the Board of Selectmen in executive session took a vote. Now, it was my hire, but I went to the board, we met in executive session, and the board voted unanimously to terminate one of the employees in the town. That individual had disagreements with 5 different departments in the town. I became a referee. And when they found out, and the reason why they found out was one member of the Board of Selectmen at the time went back and told them that the board had taken a vote to terminate the department head. And so there was a sexual harassment claim filed. They were looking to create a protective situation for themselves to prevent this from happening. Several months had transpired, and the board finally said, we've got to take this step. No matter what the cost, we had to remove that individual, and that was one of the deciding factors. The sexual harassment claim at the time was investigated by both MCAD, and the board hired an independent attorney by the name of James Lamke. At the time, he was head of the City Solicitors Association of Massachusetts. Thorough investigation on both entities. Both came back with no finding of sexual harassment whatsoever. It became very difficult to work in that environment. And as a result of that, the board decided to combine the 2 cases to bring the 2 individuals under one lawsuit to save the town money, which may not have been the best decision to make for the town or for myself. But I was working on the basic premise and assumption that the Board of Selectmen wanted this to happen. They voted to remove that individual. And as a result of that, he was terminated. He filed a whistleblower claim. It's not the first case, a whistleblower case that this individual filed. He filed one against the United States Navy when he was working for the Navy. We had a situation that we needed to take control. We needed to gain control of that situation. We lost control of the situation. It was a separate department. It was an enterprise department. And as a result of that, if I was to make the same decision again, I would do it far differently than the decision we ended up making. So I learned from that decision. But they were willing to pay the $1.6 million to get that individual out of the town. And the board said it was the best $1.6 million we spent. And at the other end, the other individual remained employed with the town for a number of years, left, and was involved when they joined the suits together. The judge reversed the jury verdict, actually reversed the jury verdict, which is unprecedented in many cases, because the judge was not convinced with the evidence that was presented that there was any kind of retaliation claim that she could substantiate based on my actions. And they ordered a new trial. The board decided to settle that case against, my better judgment. I would not have settled it, but they wanted to settle it, and they did. So that's what happened in Mansfield, and you know what happened in Abington.
Okay.
I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you, it helps. Then if I could just ask a question more
Please.
relevant to maybe the profile. So you talked a little bit about how on your first days in Abington you met with certain individuals. Could you talk a little bit more about how you would start, what other strategies you would use to get to know the community of Reading?
I would meet with all the stakeholders. We, pretty much, most communities have very similar parallel stakeholders. I'd meet with the sport organizations. I would meet with the department heads first and foremost. I would meet with the school superintendent. In basic, the dialogue would be, what do you need from me as town manager to make you successful, to make this department run efficiently, effectively, and what would you need me to do to support your efforts? What are your goals? What are your objectives? What are you looking to achieve? What's your long-range and short-term goals? How do they tie to the budget? And we would talk very succinctly about my role as coach, my role as town manager, my role as an entity that's going to support your efforts. What do you need from the town to make that happen? And I would repeat those same types of questions with the stakeholders. What are you looking to achieve? What's important to your group? And I understand that Reading has a very proud and a long history in sports, a very strong public school system. Those are not, you can't compromise those qualities. You have to support them. You have department heads that you also need to to support, and you have to balance that, and you have to establish priorities. Those priorities would obviously be priorities that the Board of Selectmen would establish as policy setters, and it would be our responsibility, both myself, the individuals who work in the town, to make sure that our efforts are designed to support your goals and objectives. So I would meet with the Lions Club. I would meet with the Rotary Club. I was a Rotarian myself. I would join those local organizations to make sure that they had a face and a visible presence from government's perspective. And that I find that works very well. I was the president of the Mansfield Rotary. I was in the organization for 12 years that I was involved as a town manager. And the wealth of information that you walk away with on a daily basis from those types of interactions, you can't replace that. You have to be there. It's not something that you can read about. You have to experience it. And you have to put a face to the corner office, so to speak, in town government. And it's important that I make sure that I immerse myself in the town, in the community. And I get to know the business owners. I get to know the stakeholders, not by name, but by interaction. It's great to know somebody's name, but it's far better to understand that person's perspective and what they're thinking and what they need and what they want out of their government and out of their town. And so I would do that. I'd spend 35 to 45 days making sure that I had a very clear, crystal clear understanding of what those stakeholders need and want in order for them to be successful.
And then, Mr. Chair, if I could just continue on that line, then with your experience, then how do you translate that and also to develop a working relationship with the board, the appointing authority? What are some of the tactics or strategies you've used to try to create an effective working relationship with the Board of Selectmen?
With the stakeholders in the board, that
Well,
bridging that
mostly-
gap, or are you talking
Well,
about?
all of that, because as you know, it's that complicated. I mean, you are in between all of those, but ultimately you report an answer to the Board of Selectmen. So I guess how do you develop or foster a relationship when you've got,
It's
Maybe have 5 new
obviously, we have 5 different personalities
Yes.
that come to the board. And it's important for me to understand each of those personalities and what information you need so that you're making the most informed decision. At the end of the day, it's about making decisions that benefit Reading. And I need to make sure that whether it's a stakeholder information, whether it's department head information, but I need to make sure that that information is at your fingertips, that you understand what is needed from the department heads or from, for that matter, from the stakeholders to become, successful. And maybe it's just as simple as, there's a Rotary is having a benefit for one of its longtime Rotarians. You need to know that. Whether you decide to attend or not is your decision. But for me to provide that information to you is important, so that not only are the Rotarians aware that you have an interest in that organization as an elected official, but that I'm conveying that information to you as a town manager to make sure, from my experience and my interactions, that you understand what the needs of the various boards and committees are. It's a very complex ability to provide that, but it's if I'm doing my job, then I'm providing you with the information that you need to do your job, and that's first and foremost the most important aspect. I need to make sure that you have the correct information so that you're making the most informed decision possible on behalf of the town, as well as the stakeholders. And you're going to get the calls at night, and you're going to get, and how about this, and how about that, and why can't we do this, and why can't, and when those types of questions come your way, I would love to hear from you. I want to know what you're hearing so that I can provide you with the information that you need to make sure that those individuals understand what the role and the process of government is all about. You become the ambassador, as well as I, to make sure that the information that we're providing is accurate. The donut shop talk and the coffee shop talk is great. And I go every Thursday. I go to Martin's Bakery in Abington, so I can sit there and listen to what's going on. And we talk. We have an hour and a half discussion about things that are going on that take a life of their own. And unless they have the right information, that takes on a different role, and it becomes sometimes unmanageable. So it's better to provide accurate information up front, whether it's to board members, whether it's to civic organizations, youth organizations, and get them the right information that they need so that they're making the most informed decision.
okay, great, thank you.
James, anything you have? Or Ben?
Well, John, you talked a bit about the progress that you had made in Abington on finances. Maybe you could take us through how you envision a budget process working that you would lead as town manager.
Here in Reading.
In Reading.
You have a very active, from what I can read, a very active finance committee, and that's great. You need a very active finance. I would attend every finance committee meeting that was scheduled, because I think it's important for the finance committee to understand the administration's goals and objectives. So I would start with what the goals and objectives of the Board of Selectmen are. What do we want to achieve in this upcoming fiscal year? Is it important to have additional police officers, school teachers, DPW workers? What are you hearing that people want as far as services are concerned? And then it's my responsibility to convey that to the finance committee, to make sure that we're all on the same page, to build a consensus budget. I understand how the format of the budget is. I do have copies of the budget here. I would hold not only budget hearings with respect to the general public, but obviously budget hearings with each of the department heads, so that I could understand where the money is and where the potential savings can be. We had a very interesting, I can share this with you from my perspective. I look at processes. I look at organizational processes, and I see where we have duplication of effort, duplication of service, and how can we streamline that so that we're operating more efficiently and effectively. That's important. We had a request from the health agent in Abington that she wanted a part-time person. And, we're kind of pushing back on the part-time person. I need to know why you need that person. What's the caseload? What's the workload? What's the process? Why do you need it? And can we do it and fulfill it in any other way that would not cost the amount of money that it would cost us to hire a part-time person with benefits? And we ended up, I forced her to look at different options and scenarios, and she came back with a handheld program for $4,500 that she could press and go through each of her inspections and print out reports and have them emailed directly to the businesses. So she doesn't need somebody to sit there and take notes as she walks through a restaurant. It's those types of efficiencies that are important to try to identify in the budget process, so that you're not adding personnel when you don't need to. This town, I think, if my information is correct, had 2 operational overrides. I think that I can, since the 1990s to the present. I am not a strong advocate for operational overrides. I'm a strong advocate for debt exclusions, for capital expenditures. But for operational overrides, I want to make sure that the organizational structure is operating as efficiently as possible. In order to do that, I have to know and go through the budget process for each and every department to understand where their money is, where their resources are, what they can do without, what they need most. Because my role is to make sure that they're successful. But my role is also to make sure that they're responsible. And they're responsible not only to the Board of Selectmen, the Finance Committee, but to the taxpayers as well. So the budget process that I would use would not only be the public meetings that are very important, but the finance team and I would meet with each of the department heads to go over their budget line by line, detail by detail, to basically find out how they're operating and where we can gain efficiencies where necessary.
Thank you.
To tie into that a little bit, John, if you could tell us about some times in Mansfield and Abington, probably more Mansfield with the length of time you were there, and even before that, where you ran up against some tough budget times, be it for whatever reason, and what type of creative budgeting you're able to come up with, besides that one example you just shared.
Whenever resources are scarce, you have some very difficult decisions to make. And I'm a decision maker. I'm not going to pass it off from one year to the next, because it doesn't do the town any good, doesn't do the department head any good, and it certainly doesn't bode well with the taxpayers in town. I guess the most difficult financial budget decisions that we had to make, whether in Abington or in Mansfield, was to convince the town side that it was important to make sure that the school side was as successful as the town side. And, you know, in Abington, I alluded to the fact that we provided $400,000 in additional revenue to regain the accreditation of the high school. That was important. That was a major objective of not only my administration, but also the school department. What was difficult was trying to explain how important that was to the fire chief, the police chief, and to indicate to them that my word was one in which I was going to make sure that when we could fulfill their obligation, we would do the same. But it's a difficult decision to make up front, and you have to make it, and you're not going to please everybody. We had some difficult times in Mansfield with the budget initially. That resulted in some consolidation efforts, similar to what you did here, where we took I know that you regionalized the veteran services here.
Yes.
We obviously regionalized the veteran services in Mansfield. We were heading in that direction before I had left. It was finally regionalized. We took all of the inspectional services divisions, whether it was the Board of Health, the building department, the wiring inspector. We consolidated them into one department and reduced some of the support staff to make that work. Now, I know that your budget is organized that way, but I don't know if the departments function the way the budget is organized. I'm assuming that they do. If they don't, I think that they probably should. And I think that you could either reduce the administrative time that you spend having administrative secretaries in each of the departments and share some of those resources. And I think that's important to look at from a functional perspective and a process perspective to make sure that that happens here. So in Mansfield, we did a lot of that, but the school system was growing at such a tremendous rate. It approximately is 70% of the budget in the town of Mansfield. And at the time you're trying to put money away in stabilization, that's when the greatest pressure to take that money and use it in other areas. And so what we did was we established a policy both in Mansfield and in Abington that basically said if there was a need to use stabilization, that money could only be used at 10% of the total amount, and that you had to demonstrate reductions and increases in efficiencies before that money would then be spent or given, to the department. And that was designed to get them to really focus on not looking at the fast solution of the money they needed from stabilization, but it was actually designed to get them to look closely at reducing their expenditure, increasing efficiency and they had to demonstrate that before they got the money.
Right.
So those types of policies and procedures are important to put in place. We're right now implementing about a 47-page policy, financial policies for Abington. They've never had a policy. Did the same thing in Mansfield. It's important that we have policies that people can identify with and that they can adapt. The Board of Selectmen would obviously have to weigh in on that because you're the policy board.
Yeah.
But it's important to determine how much risk you want this town to take in the investment arena, if you want them to take any risk at all. And it's important to make sure that you understand what that is, if there is any risk in investments, and that we are able to accommodate that and write the policy in a way that meets your comfort levels. So it's a process that requires us to work extremely well together in order to accomplish that. So it's not any one thing, but it's a series of incremental decisions that are made with a long-term goal and objective in mind that gets you to make those changes over time. It's something that's not going to happen from one budget cycle to the next, but incrementally over time, when you make those changes, like we did in Mansfield, we ended up in 2005 with Money Magazine's top 100 communities in the country to live. And that's important, because it doesn't happen to every community. And it's because you make these incremental, correct decisions over time that allow others to recognize the types of decisions that you're making and how important it is.
Good, thank you.
John, for some people living in a community that, you know, some are more involved versus others, right? What do you see, what's the role and responsibility of town hall in a community from your perspective?
To meet the needs of its residents. Basic, fundamental. That it's not, we can't do this, it's how we can do it that makes a difference. And in my leadership role as town manager, I have an open door policy. Anyone can come see me at any time. They have an issue that they need to I would be more than happy to sit with them and talk to them for hours if necessary. But when it comes to the advocates of our community, and if it comes to the individuals who have a vested interest in making sure that their particular stakeholder group is being, fairly dealt with, it's important from a top-down approach that the message to the staff people is that it's not that we can't do it, it's how do we do it that makes the difference. Because I think those are the same people who, under a representative town meeting form of government, that those people end up getting elected to the representative district, and they're the ones who are voting on your budget. So it's important for us to make sure that as we deliver those services, that we deliver them equitably, we deliver them across the organizational structure, and that we do it in a way with a mindset that, yes, we can do this, and we will do it, because it's important for us to make sure that we meet the needs and interests of our residents. They pay the taxes, and we have to make sure that we're providing them with the service that they expect and want.
How do you do that, balancing different regulations, town and state? So a resident comes in and says, I want to put this pool up, and it's in the aquifer protection district or whatever,
Mhm.
right? So if you push out that you want to, how can we do it, which is what the residents want to hear, but what do you do at that point?
If the resident knows that there is a logical reason why that can't be done, and there's a regulation, I'm not advocating that we do anything illegal. You can't. The problem in most cases is that we spend more time saying no than explaining why this can't be done. And we work with them to see if there's a way in which it can be done, to accommodate them. And it's not always going to work. I mean, sometimes no is no. But when the first response is no, without looking at possible alternatives, then we're not representing the interests of those residents. They're taxpayers.
Right.
They come to town hall, they expect a service. And we have to deliver that service if we can. But we're not going to break a statute, we're not going to break a local bylaw, we're not going to do anything that is going to be illegal in any way, shape, or form. But maybe we can look at it in a way that gets the individual what they need within the structure of the rule and regulation that we're operating under. And if we can, then we should do it.
Right.
If we can't, then we have to sit and explain to them why it can't be done and the reasons why it can't be done. And 9 times out of 10, by just sitting and taking that time to explain to that individual why it can't be done, they'll be more susceptible to accepting that than they would if, no, can't be done. Why not? Can't be done.
The law says. Thank you. John?
John, one of the facts of life here in Reading is that our split between our residential tax base and our business tax base is, 10 to 1 thereabouts. And consequently, even a small change in the business base doesn't necessarily show up on the tax Richter scale, but it's important in terms of the vitality of downtown and the diversity of the businesses in town. I'm just curious, from your past in your 2 prior town management assignments, how do you relate to the business community? How do you cut through or how do you help business navigate through town? You talked extensively about residents. Tell me a little bit about the business communities in the cities that you've.
Well, obviously in Mansfield, we have a 21% of that tax base is the industrial park. It's a beautiful industrial park. I was very successful in getting Samsonite luggage from Rhode Island up to the industrial park.
How did you do that?
First of all, I went down and met with Tom Corbis face to face, and I said to him, Tom, we would like you in Mansfield. What do we need to do to make that happen? Obviously, the tax structure. An equalized tax rate is very important to the business community. They want a stable tax base so that they can predict their operating budgets from one year to the next, and they can understand what their profit levels are. To change quickly, to increase electrical rates, to increase sewer and water rates at 10, 20, 30%. It's not going to bode very well with the business community. So I met with Tom Corbis, and over a period of 6 months, through tax incentives, because I was able to get Mansfield into an economic target area, believe it or not, by involving all of the communities in the 495 belt. We provided them with, and you have the ability to do it here, which was a direct reduction on their tax base. We gave them a lower tax obligation for 5 years, because within the next 10 years, they're still here now in Mansfield. They generate about $5 million a year in our local economic base with hotels, because they're now the world headquarters.
Sure.
And so everyone not only eats in the restaurants, books the Holiday Inn or any of the other hotels, but everyone benefits from that. And it stimulates about $5 million to the local economy. That's the importance of getting a business into this town and keeping them there, and working with them, and meeting with them, and doing the same thing we do with the private sector, with the public sector. What do you need from your government to be financially sound? What is it that you need from us, and how can we deliver it to you? And I think that's important, to make sure that you spend that time with the business community to try to not only retain them, but hopefully to have them expand here. I did it in Abington with Cape Cod Lumber. They were looking to go to Weymouth. We kept them in Mansfield. We changed the zoning to allow them to locate at a larger parcel, and the amount of money that the town's going to get in new growth is significant. And that's important, because that's a school teacher, that's a DPW worker, that's a firefighter, it's a police officer. And that's important to make sure that we are very cognizant of what their needs are, because we have to provide for them as much as we have to provide for the homeowner. It's very important that we do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm going to change a little bit from the external view to an internal view, if I can, John. You had made a comment earlier on that change is difficult in the public sector, and sometimes public sectors lag a little bit, per se, from the private sector.
Sure.
How do you address that, or how do you manage that when your staff, much of your staff is, well, they're all public, but they're also union and have different kind of views, and yet have to report to a community that's primarily all have a private sector mindset, for example, all this board. So when we look at our health benefits versus the public sector health benefits, or how we're rated and against our performance, how would you manage those dichotomies, being the town manager?
I think it's important that the public sector employees, the department heads, understand the mindset of, it's great to be immersed in town planning, public health, finance, or whatever the other the components of government are in town. It's important that they understand, just like you said, with respect to the health budget. We reduced the health budget by $390,000. We're due to save $268,000 additional dollars this year by changing plan design. We started with plan design. I need an additional $268,000. We're going to go back to the old plan, but we're going to reduce the premium split from 75-25 to 70-30 and 50-50 for the PPO plan, which is the most expensive plan. It's important that our employees know that the health plans that we have are really unheard of in the private sector. And the individuals that come to town meeting are predominantly from the private sector. They can't understand why there's a $15 copay when they're paying $25 and $30 for a copay to go to the doctor's office. It's hard to get the public sector to recognize that. And so the governor helped us out by allowing us plan design changes. And if the Board of Selectmen votes, and I'm sure you might have voted for, plan design changes, then we can implement plan design changes across the board for all unions. And that'll save you a good amount of money. I know that there was some healthcare savings in FY13. We're looking at healthcare savings in Abington, not only in 13, but in 14. And it's basically looking creatively as to how you can make that happen. Once the public sector unions realize that plan design is not the best way to go, then we have to be in a position as leaders to give them an alternative that's not only a win-win situation for them, but also for the town. How can we save additional money? It's important for us to be able to articulate that to them, to be upfront, to be honest, and to tell them that this savings is going to benefit them because it's going to keep positions, it's going to maintain a level of service that's important, and it's going to give us the opportunity to provide a better level of care while still saving money, creating a win-win situation. And that's important because the mindset of the general public is the healthcare benefits are unheard of. That, up until 2 years ago or 3 years, I was paying $5 an office visit. And people know. The nurse at my doctor's office goes, "Oh, you must work for the public sector. You had a $5 copay." It's unheard of today. And so we have to align ourselves with what's more realistic in the private sector, because it's important for us to show to the private sector that we're willing to make that move, understanding that it's going to cost us more money, but it's going to save the town more. Now, you had 2 operational overrides of close to $6.9 million, and some of it had to do with sidewalks, and some of it had to do with other capital projects. But unless we are willing to show to the general public our willingness as public servants to dig deeper into our pockets for health care. I know my wife doesn't like the health care plan that we're on in Abington. We're getting billed for every kind of test and radiology service and what have you, but it saves the town $390,000 and an additional $268 next year. So it's worth it for us to do that. And while the unions didn't like it, it was a series of meetings dialogue, sitting down, discussing it with them, and coming up with a plan of action that they could relate to and understand that this is going to benefit them in the long run. While it's going to cost them more money out of pocket, it's going to save positions. It's going to help us balance the budget, and it's going to allow us to do so and demonstrate to the general public that we're willing to do our share as public servants to make sure that the healthcare plans that we have are in line with what they have. It's important.
Rick?
John, as you know, back to the profile, some of the things that are the challenges. What would you say is your greatest strength? I mean, you talked about the process, the transparency, and the openness. What about leadership and the skills that you could bring to the role of town manager if you were selected for Reading?
If you ask any of the employees that work for me, you will know from them that I am not the type of person that's going to ask them to do something that I'm not willing to do myself. If it means extra hours at town hall to get objective A or B or C completed, then I'm there with them. Because I can't ask them to do something I'm not willing to do myself. And so, for me, it's about leadership through example. It's about painting a vision and a direction not only for them to follow as department heads, but for the town to follow as a whole. And it's predicated, and it involves mission, goals, and objectives, and how we're going to meet them. And if this board comes up with goals and objectives, it's everybody's goal and objective. It's not just mine. And it requires us to work together to accomplish that. Because I'm going to demonstrate to them that in order for them to be successful, I'm going to support them. I'm going to support their initiatives. And in turn, they're going to support ours. And it's that kind of mutual trust and dialogue between the department heads, the townspeople, and government, that we're all pulling in the same direction. It makes absolutely no sense. And unfortunately, which is what's happening in Abington to a measurable degree, we've got all our oars in the water, but half of them are going one way, the other half are going the other way. And at the end of the day, we're accomplishing nothing. And it's about results. I'm a very results-oriented leader. I don't necessarily account for time. I account for outcome. I want to know how productive you're going to be and how you're going to meet those goals and objectives that we set out. It's not about the hours you spend in government as much as it is about productivity and outcome. I want to make sure that my department heads are as productive as they can be. I'm going to support that, and in turn, they're going to support my initiatives. And I'll give you a great example. I have given some responsibilities to the assistant town manager. I wanted the individual to do some municipal grants, to get some of those grants out there. You know, I assigned her the task, and I'm kind of a hands-off approach to, they know what they have to do. I'm very articulate. I'll tell them what they need to do, and I want them to do it. I'm not going to tell them how to do it. I want them to do it. And there was a grant that we were writing, and she put a team together, and they stayed until 10:30, 11 o'clock, 2 nights consecutively to get that grant done. Not because there was the deadline, as much as it was they didn't want to disappoint me, and they wanted my expectation, they wanted to meet my expectation, which I thought really illustrates the type of impact as a leader you can have if you're willing to put yourself on the line with them and share with them in the duties and responsibilities that they have to meet. And so I think that that's a very good example of how important it is in your leadership ability to be able to translate that into an action step that they're going to do whatever it takes to get that done. It's about outcome. And, that was, I think, a very good example most recently.
And when you spoke about all the oars in the water, but different directions, what techniques can you use, or have you tried maybe even Abington to try to get them rowing together?
Well, that's part of why I can't get along with some of the boards and committees. It's, and it really isn't the case at all, but it's trying to get those oars aligned. It's a different structure of government than you have here. You have a very strong town manager form of government. In Abington, you have a confederation of independent boards and committees. And so most of those boards and committees are elected. And so they think that it's their responsibility to do X, Y, and Z. We've been able to get many of those committees to begin to look at the town as a whole and work towards that common goal and objective. It'd be a lot easier in this structure of government than in the structure that I'm working with now in Abington. And so it depends predominantly on the structure of government and how well we can get that done.
Thanks.
Kind of in the same vein with leadership, but part of being the town manager, an important piece is emergency management. And something that, obviously, the protection of our citizens and the business is very important. So if you could give us an example of how you've handled emergencies, either in Mansfield or Abington or whatever, and just step us through an example.
In Mansfield, we are an emergency-ready accredited community, which means that all of our resources are coordinated. I'm involved in every aspect of that coordination with the police chief, the fire chief, the highway superintendent. We have meetings before a storm. We're constantly in contact with each other during the storms. And we sit down after each storm and evaluate what went well, what we can improve on, what we need to do differently. So it's a constant continuous improvement cycle for us. And we meet with the police chief, the fire chief, the highway superintendent, water, sewer. All of our entities come together prior to a storm to understand role responsibility. We set up a centralized phone data bank, so there's not cross communication. There's intercommunication. Everyone is communicating on the same network of phones or radios. And then we're obviously coordinating that with MEMA. We're also coordinating with, in Abington's perspective, we don't have a public utility, which is great. If you have a public utility, that is obviously far better than waiting for NSTAR. But I have established such a strong working relationship with NSTAR that during the last two storms, we had very minimal outages, and when those outages occurred, they were fixed within 8 to 12 hours. Unheard of in a municipality that has a light department. You get that light, those lights back on real quick. But in communities that you don't, obviously Abington being one of them, you have to wait a while. But it's working with the various entities to make sure that we're all coordinated, that it doesn't come down to, I thought you were going to do this, or I thought you were going to do that. It's how we're going to do that together, and what your role and responsibility is articulated, clearly defined, and implemented. Before the storm, during the storm, and after the storm, we debrief ourselves. We find out what worked, what didn't work. I knew at the time when we were meeting, we had 4 personnel that were newly hired in the highway department in Abington, and there was a concern that they weren't going to know their routes, they weren't going to get them done properly. So we outfitted them with a GPS phone system that identified the routes that they had, that they needed to get done, and we actually sent a more seasoned person with the new hire as well, to make sure that the roads were opened as wide as they could be. In a storm, it's very important that all of your resources are committed to the public safety and well-being of the residents. That the roads are open, that we're down to pavement within a matter of hours after the storm ends. And that because that's what they can relate to. And they see it. And if we're not down to pavement within a couple of hours afterwards, then, we've got to change our process. Our sidewalk plows, which last year I purchased new sidewalk plows, we were able to open school a day earlier than most of the other communities because of that investment that we made last year. And we had up-to-date sidewalk plows and equipment. And I think that might have been an issue here at some point. And you have to match your mission, goals, and objectives with the resources that you have. And if all of your kids walk to school, then it's as equally important to make sure that your sidewalks are taken care of, as well as your streets. And if that's an issue, it needs to be addressed. You need to get those sidewalk plows. You need to get updated equipment. And the kids didn't like it, because in Abington, they went back to school a day early. But you know what? The parents who pay the bills loved it.
That's right.
And so that's important.
So you were hit by quite a few snowballs that day, I take it?
Well, the kids weren't happy. Yeah. And it's funny because the town hall is in back of the high school. So when I'm driving down and they're back to school a day early, I try not to get too involved with their traffic jam.
Absolutely.
Throw out a question since nobody's got one ready, but you'd mentioned, and we do, that this town, Reading, invests in what we call a coalition against substance abuse.
Mhm.
And thank you for recognizing that. That's something that's very important in this town.
It's very important.
If you could tell me how, in Mansfield, I'm thinking specifically Mansfield, how you balance like economic development, and I'm thinking specifically you have a concert venue there, and then you also have, which is a great revenue driver, I would imagine, for the town, but you have public safety issues, you probably have some alcohol and substance abuse issues. How do you balance that as a town manager and as a leader? And not the specific, like, how many police do you have on, but how do you balance that based on what we're trying to achieve here?
I think you have to plan appropriately. You have to understand what your resource base is. And I can speak to Mansfield to a measurable degree. We created an entertainment license that required a certain amount of staffing for public safety personnel, particularly for fire. And we're going to do, that'll also happen for the police officers. The venue has their own private security force, but that security force can't arrest anybody. So they rely on the Mansfield Police Department, and they draw from a number of different communities in a mutual aid type fashion to bring in the amount of resources that they need to sufficiently deal with the escalating open container and drug issues that are going on in that venue. And it's a very difficult process, because it's like putting your fingers in a dike and making sure that you got all of the holes, covered, so that nothing goes wrong. But invariably, when you mix alcohol and drugs, teenage consumption, concerts, and it really depends upon the type of concert that they have. A Jimmy Buffett concert is a little older. Probably all of us can go to a Jimmy Buffett concert. And
Not anymore.
Not anymore?
It's changed too.
And
I'll just put it out there.
it has. You're absolutely correct. But in any respect, you don't want the type of band drawing a clientele of young kids to a venue that's going to end up with high drug and alcohol use and consumption. And so you control, through the license agreement, the types of venues that come to the Tweeter Center, or in this case, Comcast Center, Great Woods. And you have 19 to 22,000 people on hand on any given night. And it requires additional police protection, coordination, fire protection, coordination. You have challenges in Reading that are very important as well. And one of the biggest challenges you have is it's an affluent community with a decent amount of disposable income. And you have a lot of drugs coming in and out of the community. And education, intervention, what we did in Mansfield was we had Peter Vargas, who was our, not a DARE officer, but a resource officer in the school system, working with those kids on a daily basis. And if you get the right personality working in that type of an environment, those kids will respect that police officer and actually give them information that they need in order to become more effective in their investigation and in preventing drug use and abuse. But you have to match the personality with the position and the goal and objective that you're trying to achieve. It's hard because there's not one single answer. There's not a silver lining in any of this. But you have to commit resources in a way that's going to get you the outcomes that you're looking for. Understand what those outcomes are and be able to measure them to see if the amount of money that you're investing is actually working. And maybe you need to look at the envelope, pressing that envelope to find more creative programs on a national level or on a regional level that are going to help you address those issues, long-term and short-term.
Thank you. I have one more, and then
Please.
that'll be it for me.
Okay.
You know, the world in which we're all living in is changing faster than it has been in the past, but especially here in Massachusetts, and I can say that because I'm born and raised here. What are you seeing in not just in Reading, but any community, wherever you're town manager? What are the biggest challenges that you foresee in the community from working as a community in the state of Massachusetts? And how do you have plans to help address those? And some of it may be out of the control of a town manager. And what resources would you as a town manager need to address those concerns?
I could never understand, although, there's only 5 commonwealths in the nation, and Massachusetts is one of them, where you have duplication of resources in every community in the 351 cities and towns. It's very difficult to reach a point of regionalization. We did it with the fire department in Abington, where we got rid of the dispatchers at the fire department, and we went to a Holbrook regional dispatch service. Very difficult to do, a very challenging issue, but it's the future. And we have to recognize that. It's not only regionalizing your veteran services, it's how effectively you can regionalize services and maintain or increase the level of service that you currently have. And to do it in a way, like we have these intermunicipal agreements that we can now do without having to go to town meeting. And we did it in Holbrook. We're spending a couple of $100,000 on dispatchers and salaries and benefits. We contracted with Holbrook and saved $100,000. And we have a better service. And the fire department loves it. You had to negotiate with the union. You had to get language that would allow you to do that. And then you had to then implement it in a way that protected the safety of those firefighters on the street, in a burning fire, in a house. And so it was a challenge. But just because it's not something that you're gonna be able to implement in 1 year. It took me 3 years to do it, but we finally got there. And we hired a chief that was willing to also implement, a regional dispatch service for the fire department. So when you have this top-down approach and you have a direction that you want to go, when you articulate that direction, it becomes easier to meet those challenges. But some of them, as you had alluded to, are very difficult to meet in a Commonwealth type setup, where each community has its own individual structure of government. Now, Reading's structure may be different from North Reading or any of the abutting community, Burlington or what have you, and they're all different. But it doesn't mean that just because we're different, that we can't try to meet that challenge over the next, several years, to regionalize certain services that make sense, to regionalize. In Florida, for example, the structure of government down there, they're county governments that are functional. In Massachusetts, the county governments can be functional and they can be dysfunctional. And they provide police services and fire services on a regional basis. That makes sense in an economy where resources are dwindling. Is it something that we can do here? I don't know. I'd have to look at, evaluate, and be able to make that determination. But it's going to be very difficult. And those are the challenges that municipal government in Massachusetts face over the next several years, is how do we make ourselves more efficient by reorganizing not only, our departments within the town, but how do we do it on a regional basis if we can, to save money? Because our resources are not growing, and our costs and our fixed costs are exceeding our increase in revenue. And so something has to give, and we have to do it in a way that makes sense, that keeps the level of service where it is or increases it, and it doesn't put our people in harm's way, but allows us the ability to think outside of the box, push the envelope, and be able to and be able to make some of these changes in a way that is meaningful, that's going to save money for the town. It's about saving money so that we can continue to provide the level of service that the residents of this community want.
Good. Thank you.
You all set?
Questions for everyone?
You're all set? So, we've been giving you a lot of questions, and thank you for the information you've been sharing. At this point, any questions you have for us in regards to the town or process?
Well, let me understand what the process is. From my perspective, you're going to make a decision, fairly quick. If you were to make a decision, when do you expect that person to start? I know that I had read that there would be some. First of all, let me just say this. I think, Peter is a magnificent manager. He's done a marvelous job here for the years that he's been here. And there's an awful lot that anyone can learn from Peter. And I do know that there would be some transition period between when Peter ends and the new person. What do you look at for that transition period? What are you looking at?
We, I think right now we have scheduled probably a 2-week transition period overlap, right? And Pete's finished June 1st. So we'll be looking for a 2-week overlap. We're gonna finish interviews, the 3 candidates tonight, and then next week we'll have some discussion, and if each board member does its own due diligence and it's completed, most likely we'll have a decision by next week. If not, by the 19th at the latest, we'll make a vote, and that'll be our decision point. At that point, then we'll start to do the contract and iron out all the details for that. So we're looking at an end of May starting point for this. Anything I missed there?
No, it's interesting or worth noting when you said working on contracts there. Unfortunately for us, Steve and Rick will have to decide not to run again, so we'll have new bodies in those seats, working with the new town manager and actually working through some of the contract perspective as we work with Carol, who's not here. But thought that was worth noting.
Yeah.
And also, you usually like to do this in the beginning. I didn't do this with you, but congratulations. I mean, this has been a process that this town's taken very seriously. We've done our due diligence. We have an applicant pool of 30, which we've narrowed down to the 3 of you. So you should be, in our opinion, very proud of yourself because we have high standards here, and so I'd like to congratulate you.
And I appreciate that very much, and it's an honor to be here tonight and to answer your questions and to be part of this process. It's a learning process for anyone who embarks on this kind of a process. And for me, I am very honored that Reading has considered me in this status to be here, to allow me to give you my attributes and what I think I can bring to Reading. And I would just end by saying that my role as a community leader, my role as a town manager, and my role as a public servant is to inherit a community at a certain level and to make sure that when I leave, that this community is far better off than what I inherited when I came here. And so I think that that's very important for any public servant to recognize, to maintain as their goal and objective, and to actually implement. In every community that I have ever served, I have left that community far better off than when I inherited it. And I think that that's important for whoever is sitting in the town manager's role and following Peter.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time tonight, and we just have one more, and then we'll be in touch with you in the next couple of weeks.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I
John,
appreciate
thank you for your time.
Thank you.
See you again.
Great.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
John, thank you. It was great meeting you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Pleasure meeting you.
John, it's very nice to hear you and meet you finally.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Likewise.
Thanks. So at this point, we'll take about a 5, almost 10-minute break, and we'll get started on the second one, the last one.